so much of this?
Locally, it is. What's neat about Caulk's Field is you can hold it in your hands. It's not enormous. And, you know, in Bladensburg, it's like this. Caulk's Field is like this. And yet, there were 4 or 5 books that came out of people who were there. So in some ways, it was an intimate battle, if battles can be intimate. But, you know, I think we know more about it than we do about some of the much bigger ones, from the participants' perspective. You know.
What's really unique about this one is, and it just happened to be the theater of war, you had the largest army and the largest navy in the world bearing down on the brand new United States of America. And some of them have referred to this as the Second Revolutionary War, because it was still Mother England picking on the colonists to some extent. At least that's probably how they thought of it. What's important about this particular Kent County event is, and it was a rare one, we won. And it was a critical morale booster. Only the week before, the British had burned down Washington, D.C., you know, the fledgling capital. And they were taking aim at Baltimore. And one of the things they had to do to make their attack on Baltimore successful was to make sure that we didn't have reinforcements coming from the Eastern Shore. And so they assigned several people, several officers, to distract the attention of those on the Eastern Shore. One of them was Sir Peter Parker, the commander of the Menelaus, and his crew of sailors and Marines. And so they came over here to do just that. He was spoiling for a fight, and he got wind that there was a regiment of American militia here, and thought, okay, let's do that. So in the process of essentially terrorizing a local plantation, he got word that regiment was here, and he said, well, we need to, you know, attack these guys right away. So it turned into a late night affair, and he was offloading Marines and sailors on the longboats to come into, you know, to head towards Fairleigh at 11 o'clock at night, and you know they engaged about 1 o'clock in the morning. So you got to picture this. It's full moon, so they had some light, but you know what it's like in a full moon. If you want to find out, there's a full moon tonight. Just go out to Caulk's Field, and if you can see anything, you'd be amazed. But so they attacked at 1 o'clock in the morning, and you know, Reed was ready for them. Reed knew the country. He knew, or not the country, but rather the countryside. He was on his home turf. He lived in Huntingfield, which is you know, just south of Rock Hall. So he knew the road. He had cannons. He had slightly larger complement of soldiers. They were all, you know, volunteers, and they hadn't really seen battle. But he was a veteran, and he was, you know, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and he was a very good tactician. And because of that, he was very prepared for this. He knew they were coming. He had cavalry vedettes, what they call vedettes, just wandering groups of small units of cavalry keeping an eye on the British. So he knew they were coming. He knew how they were coming. So he was able to rearrange his force so that, you know, come on down, come see us. We're here. We're ready for you. And that's exactly what happened. And the British, on the other hand, they didn't know the countryside. You know, they were working in the dark. They were on foot primarily, and I say that because for a brief while their commander was on horseback, but just for a very brief while. And so it was the one advantage they had was that they were using tried, veteran British Royal Marines. They had about 50 Royal Marines with about 85 sailors, and you know, these guys are tough. They knew what they were doing in terms of fighting, whereas the Americans, you know, all volunteers that probably had never seen a whizzing musket ball in action ever, you know. So so the stage was set for an interesting battle. It's night. You have veterans on one side. You got entrenched militia on the led by a really, really sharp tactician, and consequently, things turned out poorly for the British. And you know, that's what we're finding out. We're getting, because there is a little to do, a little, you know, it's a bicentennial, and you know, the state of Maryland was one of the seats of the war, along with, you know, on the other side was Canada, where a lot of action took place. But the Chesapeake Bay was a main theater of operation for the British. They had their basically their floating fortresses, all their frigates, and you know, all, you know, they came right in. They you know, put in a headquarters at some of the islands, and you know, they basically took over. These were the tough guys. These were the you know, the biggest force, armed force in the world at that time. They had just defeated Napoleon, and they were cocky. And you know, upstart Americans, you know, what are they? You know, what do they know? So I mean, that's why. That's the long answer to the short question of why there's some excitement here. This was approximately a week after Washington was burned. Washington was burned on August 24th. You know, you had Coburn, Admiral Coburn, the guy who burned Georgetown a year earlier. He dined at the White House before he burnt, set it aflame. So you know, pretty interesting stuff. And, you know, the locals were, you know, very excited about that. But what's interesting about that, Washington was a symbolic center of the nation, but it really didn't have any strategic importance other than, you know, the seat of government was there. But it was a loose seat, if I may, and you know, Madison, he left, you know, the government was secured someplace else for a little while, and they were really eyeing Baltimore, you know, strategic commerce, military center, industrial complex, you know, and it strategically had a lot more value to the British. Take that. So they created this, not a ruse, but they had a campaign that involved, you know, a feint over here on the east side, and you know, they didn't want to make it painfully obvious that they were going to attack Baltimore until they got pretty close, and you know, as part of their strategy, and we know how that ended up. So you think about it, the number of combatants, 174 American militia against 145 British soldiers, just doesn't seem that huge of a deal. But again, as a morale builder, it was. So it's pretty exciting. We're going to reenact it. This battle's never been reenacted. We're going to have near the complement of soldiers, both on the British side and the American side. You know, when I say near, we'll probably have 140 total reenactors for both sides, so approximately 60% of whatever that is. And you know, that's very exciting. These reenactors are extremely dedicated to the craft, and they're professional, and we've been given the opportunity. We're going to have this battle in the same place, on the same day, 200 years later. And how cool is that? And the battlefield is pristine. It's one of the most pristine battlefields east of the Mississippi River. Any battle, or any war. And consequently, you know, it's right there. People will be standing on the exact battlefield to watch this thing. Who knows what? They could be standing over graves, as far as we know, because there are still 12 British soldiers buried on that field. Somewhere, we don't know where. You know, and so, and that leads to the next aspect of this. There's a ceremonial part of this that is equally as important, perhaps less exciting.
When I learned about Caulk's Field and learned that there were still British buried there, I called the embassy, and I fortunately got to speak to a Royal Marine colonel who was amazed to hear about that. And he came up, looked at the field, and said, "This is not right. We have to do something about that. And I'll go to London, I'll straighten it out." And this goes back 4 or 5 years. And there was a flurry of emails. And then they said, "Okay, here's how it boils out. The ship or the regiment? The ship is no longer in commission. The regiment is. The regiment must pay for a new monument." And then they put the armor on the regiment, and that's why there will be no British marker at Caulk's Field dedicated on the 31st. And will be the only battlefield in North America that flies both flags and has a monument to both sides. And I think that's going to be pretty cool, and I think that's going to bring a lot of Canadians down to see what we've done.
And that leads right into it, is the personalities involved. You know, Sir Peter Parker was a nobleman. It was a big deal that he was killed, and you know, he was a baronet, in fact. But there's also anytime you get into the human part of this, of a battle, and you start looking at, for example, John Sands was one of the British midshipmen. He was killed 13 years old. Most people don't understand that midshipmen on a British ship were young, they were teenagers, and he happened to be the youngest one on board. And that's kind of sad. You know, there were 14 killed, 27 badly wounded, including one of the Marine lieutenants, or two of the Marine lieutenants, I think, were wounded pretty badly. I mean, it was a bad contest for them. And even later on, some of the British combatants that were involved questioned, you know, the sense of Parker doing that. And Steve and I, we kind of looked at Parker's state of mind, because, you know, it was strategically just an awful battle for him. He didn't know the land. He didn't, you know, it was dark. He didn't really know the force he was up against. He marched farther inland than he had expected to, and there's a point at which you say, hey, this is too far from the ship. We need to get back. And he didn't do that. He just kept on going. And you know, it kind of reminds me of Custer's last stand a little bit. With the, you know.
It's possible that Parker was a little bit upset that week because he had been not invited to the party in Washington, had been sent off to take care of the farmers on the Eastern Shore. And if you read his history that week, he got a little erratic. Among other things, he tried to invade Annapolis on the 21st. It's not well known, but it's in the log of the ship that he put 200 men in boats at night, and they rowed for 4 and 5 hours, got lost, ran aground, and never got ashore. But he had sent a dispatch off to Cochrane saying, listen, you know, I can take Annapolis. It's empty. It was empty because everybody was at Bladensburg. But Cochrane said, I told you to go up to the Eastern Shore. You don't have to invade Annapolis. Parker that week was a little, I think, uptight. And, you know, if you go back and look at the logs in England, Parker's log for August is missing. The August pages are not there. The Mastermake's log is there, and it shows signs of being rewritten on certain times. And in hindsight, probably because of Parker's family being noblemen, had a reputation that the admiral thought, you know, would just sweep all this under the rug. And it wasn't learned until about 5 years ago that those pages are missing. The August pages are gone. So it would have been very interesting to see what Parker wrote in those 10 days between the 20th and 30th.
And that's the part of it I enjoy somewhat, is getting into the human factor here and finding out a little bit about these folks. Obviously, Parker was pompous, he was arrogant, he looked down on the Americans, and as did most of his ilk. There was a little kind of a pushback about how they were conducting the battle, because they, you know, fighting at night and attacking civilians, while, you know, in today's sense, you know, you hear about civilians being killed all day. You look at Gaza, you know, for example, and it's meaningless. But back then there was an honor code, and you just didn't attack civilians. It just wasn't done. You didn't burn down their houses, and that's how they were conducting it. Some of it made sense. They had to get supplies. They had a really long supply line, so I mean they had to take from the land. But the underlying philosophy was that the Americans were, you know, just hayseeds. They were just hillbillies, you know, and that's the way they looked.